Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majori and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. Welcome to all listeners, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at Cybersauna. Vulnerabilities and security gaps are being identified in software and applications daily, and increasingly so. Unfortunately, this gives attackers yet more windows of opportunity to do their dirty work. They are often quick to act when any vulnerabilities are made known, even within minutes. You may have heard of the term patching in cybersecurity, but what is it exactly and how does it figure into an organization's security posture? I'm joined today by WithSecure security consultants Katie Inns and Antti Laatikainen to discuss all things patching and how it can be the difference between secure and vulnerable systems. Welcome, guys. So, what is patching? What are we talking about?
Well, from my perspective, patching is pretty much correcting past errors. So, applications are developed by people, written by developers, and basically all the hardware device up from hardware devices, they're running some type of software. And people make mistakes, and we realize that this could have been done better, or we've done some error somewhere, and then we correct them afterwards. And the correction is basically a patch.
You could also say patching is similar to, say, for example, maybe your window is broken in your house. You decide to put like a wooden board over it, and that's effectively patching. You know, you're preventing bad things from happening by effectively putting a patch over it. You could effectively replace the window, so that could be upgrading. Or if you decide to just not do anything at all, so leave the window broken, you then open up effectively a window of opportunity for other things to happen. So somebody could break in, the rain could get in, you could lose money because your heating is literally going out the window. So if you don't address the things that need patching, then effectively, you're opening yourself up to other things that could happen to you.
But you know, my phone is getting updates all the time. My Windows is getting updates all the time. You know, we're all consumers of these different things that get patched or updated all the time. Why is this a problem on the business side? Why don't they just have the auto update on?
I think it's pretty much about like handling the risks, since sometimes patching changes how applications work or how systems work, and they require testing. So there's a lot of like manual things which are like on consumer devices. They are pretty much pushed to the consumer, the risks about something going wrong. But companies tend to like to handle their risks in different manner. And that's why there are like people taking care of it and testing it out and rolling the patches on more controlled manner than just, dropping them. So that takes time, and it makes things a bit complicated.
Yeah, especially for like older organizations, potentially if they've got legacy systems hanging about. This obviously could impact if they have to take things offline, or the system's just not built to be taken offline, or, it could be a critical system as well, which people generally don't tend to patch because it's going to be too much of a risk to take that system offline. So, difficulties in that space as well.
Okay, so you updating a system, you might break a dependency somewhere that you weren't even aware of. And I guess the problem is complicated. Sometimes my clients tell me that, they're not, sure who owns a system, like who at the end of the day makes the decisions about a particular system or a piece of software. Is that a common thing?
Yeah, it's very common. It's that kind of like ownership of things and ownership of practices. It gets complicated, especially in larger companies, pretty quickly. And the other part about the sort of enterprise environments or corporate environments is that the technological stack that they have is much more complex than at your home. You at home you might have a internet router and a smart TV and your smartphone, a couple of tablets, something like this. But in let's say mixed environment corporate network where you can have like cloud services on, and besides you have local networks, routers, firewalls, whatnot, like physical servers, virtualization platforms, all the things from operating systems to applications. So there's a lot of like different technologies that you need to look after. And you might not have that kind of complexity at your home systems. So that's also part of the problem, that for the hackers, they don't mind if the vulnerability or the patching need is in the Linux systems or Windows systems. They just go through wherever they can. But on corporate level, those systems might be handled by whole different teams. So the patching visibility, the patching tools used, the visibility or monitoring capabilities to the level of patching is different, and it might be operated by different teams. So it gets complicated pretty quickly.
So what does this problem look like to you guys?
So I guess a good example is actually one that came from our incident response team. So this was the No Pineapple incident that's recently been published. And that's actually a classic example of where an organization didn't pay attention to app-level patching. And the attacker actually got in through an unpatched Zimba instance. And Zimba is actually being commonly targeted in terms of just a standard technology. But we know that attackers are targeting it because they can gain access to internal networks effectively. So this is how the attacker got in. And it's just a classic example of where, organizations just focus on infrastructure level patching, but actually the most important things are the outer layer, which tend to be the application level patches as well.
So how do organizations approach patching? Like, what's a typical way? What would be an ideal way of taking care of patching? So
typically for infrastructure patching, this is generally carried out on a monthly basis, like on a monthly cycle. So it all actually starts with understanding what you've actually got across your estate. So whether that's internally and externally, everything within that scope needs to be within the patching cycle. So you need to make sure you've obviously got a good asset management process. So quite a lot of organizations actually struggle with maintaining a good asset list and like a good CMDB, but this is going to make patching a lot easier. So those assets are generally enrolled into a monthly patching cycle, and this makes it a lot easier to manage. But actually organizations, in terms of app level patching, this is where it kind of gets a little bit less frequent, I guess. So it's quite easy to align your infrastructure patching with, for example, Microsoft's like Patch Tuesday or monthly patch cycles, but app level patching depends on each team and who's responsible for which application. And especially if you don't have a good understanding of the assets you've got, then that's going to make things a lot harder as well. So that's another thing to throw into the mix.
And don't get us even started on like developing your own software.
I was going to get you started because, I understand that asset management, it sounds simple. Just make a list of everything you have. But I've seen a lot of clients struggling with that. Like just maintaining that map seems a hard thing. And even before we get into, like Antti, you said, developing your own software, coming up with that bill of materials, all the libraries, dependencies, all the third-party thingamajigs that go into your software.
Yeah, the visibility part is pretty hard. It's like it's very close to my heart since I think when I started in IT, like some 20 years ago or something, the first server system that I ever implemented as at that point security administrator or network administrator was a Visa server. At that time, I was working in medical industry. We were hosting our own data center and hosting our own handling everything by ourselves, like in-house, like it was fashioned at that time. We didn't have a system that would show us the patching level of our Windows systems, like laptops and servers. So we started off by installing Visas, and that was the first time that we got like some visibility that has everyone patched their systems. And that was like an eye-opener for me that there's no way to handle this stuff in enterprise environment without proper visibility. And the first thing, like Katie just said it, for example, the patching needs starts from infrastructure devices and like firmware applications that are running on hardware, like, on the servers themselves and the infrastructure devices. It's very complicated to get that visibility. Like the asset list is one thing. You naturally have to know what devices you have and what's the manufacturer and the maker and the model is. But then there comes this like supercritical patch that you should install like right away into these models with this kind of application version running. So can you actually see from somewhere that which operating systems are your routers running right now? And you might already have some visibility to, for example, your laptops and the operating systems, because that's like the bread and butter of the security teams and the IT teams to take a look at something like that. But do you know which like firmware versions are your like load balancers running on their hardware models?
Okay. But hard as it is, this is something that organizations need to handle, because we're seeing attacks on unpatched systems. Because basically, what like an unpatched system, if I understand it correctly, is it's something that has known vulnerabilities in it, and sometimes there are even like active proofs of concept, like this is how you attack this vulnerability. So there is that code somebody can just take and weaponize into an attack. So this is not just a little clink in your armor, like this is a door wide open into your system.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And even what makes it a bit nastier is that these operational flaws in applications or operating systems or wherever the vulnerability is, that they're quite often such of nature that exploiting them quite often bypasses many of the other like security features and security controls that you might have. So if you have like a vulnerable network browser, for example, or the web browser, and you use that, someone exploits it, but drops an exploit towards it. It might be that, for example, the endpoint protection doesn't catch it because it seems like a legit thing that your web browser is supposed to be doing. It's just that, it's not supposed to do that. But this kind of like aspect where the vulnerabilities are on, if you take it like from that side, they're like, I would say the most important thing that you can do as a low-hanging fruit to improve your like technical security posture is just to patch the stuff as soon as possible.
Yeah, definitely. I think obviously unpatched systems and unpatched applications, they're just easy targets for attackers really. But obviously it's a lot for organizations to try and patch everything as soon as possible and understand everything that they've got and to approach that problem like as a whole really. So I guess to make things a lot easier, organizations can look at like prioritizing the list. So identifying what's most important to them, what are the most critical systems across their estate, having a good understanding of what they've got in terms of the technology stack and prioritizing based on whether there's proof of concept exploits, is the vulnerability actively being exploited in the wild, and then go from there.
Is that something that's easy to stay abreast of, like keep tracks of like what's happening, what's being exploited in the wild?
Yeah, definitely. So the CISA actually publish a list on a frequent basis that lists which vulnerabilities are actively exploited in the wild. And we've also got, obviously, our threat intelligence team monitor that quite regularly as well and feed that data into what we do as an ASM team. So that can definitely be monitored, and organizations can access that information easily as well.
Yeah, I think majority of the manufacturers, whether they're like hardware devices or applications, they should be publishing their own like feeds of vulnerabilities to their end users and clients or customers. So coming from security and risk management part of things, that if your company is using technology whose manufacturer won't give you like heads up whenever there's vulnerabilities, you might be rethinking of you using their technology. So yeah, it should be made easy for everybody to access it. So if you are using, let's say, someone's firewalls, then that firewall manufacturer will keep you up to date when there's like anything to patch on those devices.
That's an interesting point, actually. There was a vulnerability release quite recently in Go Anywhere, and they didn't actually release the technical details. It was behind a paywall, so you had to obviously sign up to the website and pay whatever subscription fee to be able to access the technical details of the vulnerability and actually get an understanding of what the vulnerability was. So that obviously prevents organizations from effectively testing their systems or even patching to some degree.
So is that the reason why there is even a market for services like Katie, you mentioned ASMR, Attack Surface Management Service. Is that the reason there's a market for these services?
Potentially, not so much in terms of preventing organisations from putting vulnerabilities behind a paywall, but more in the sense of
getting the information.
Yeah, definitely in terms of getting the information and just helping organisations have a better understanding of what they've got really and how they could potentially be at risk.
Yeah, it's super important for companies to have that practice in place. I work quite a lot with PCI DSS related services, so this payment card industry data security standard affecting like credit card payment transactions and the infrastructures and the systems behind it. And the PCI Council has this forensics investigation process that is like official way of investigating when someone's credit cards get stolen somewhere. And they just released like the latest statistics on which PCI controls were used or like broken when a breach happened in a credit card transaction handling environment last year. And people working with PCI might know that it's sort of like dissected into segments, defining different security controls that you need to follow from like password policies and user access rights and that kind of things, like separation of networks. And 50%, like half of the breaches that happened in last year into these like high security environments that are handling credit card information is coming from PCI segment 6, and that means vulnerability management and patch management. So like half of these high-tech environments were breached because they had unpatched servers running and published to the internet. And like
wow.
2023. And that's incredible.
Well, that certainly has been my experience as well. I remember this one client meeting where we were looking at the findings, vulnerabilities in their systems, and I was looking at one CV number, and I was saying, like, look at that, the year there, like that's 14 years old. That vulnerability is older than some of the people who are attacking your systems with it.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's not a far. Well, everybody remembers like Heartbleeds and stuff like that. So when like, let's get into that software development later on. But all the applications are nowadays they're basically like Legos. So you put them up from modules, and some modules, if they're handy and they're available, people just use it without thinking. And you might have like these 20-year-old bugs running in some module that people are using in the latest firewalls they're like bleeding edge security devices, and they're using stuff like that with like 20 years old vulnerabilities.
All right, because Katie, you were saying earlier that sometimes the circle here is pretty fast, that we can go from when a vulnerability is publicly disclosed to when it's being attacked, and can take like a very short amount of time. So, we were also talking about how patch cycles can be like once a month or stuff like that. So that's clearly not enough. But then again, there are obviously organizations who are not even doing that if they have vulnerabilities over a year old and stuff like that. So what's happening?
Yeah, well, there's definitely a counter argument to that as well. There's a lot of research out there to suggest that the vulnerabilities that are most commonly exploited are the ones that are most recently released. Mm-hmm. I think definitely within the last year to 2 years, if you look at vulnerabilities like Log4j and on Microsoft Exchange, as soon as they were released, they were being exploited within like the first few days. And that just doesn't give organizations a chance to be able to patch things like that. So it's like they're fighting against the attackers for like patch against exploitation, I guess. So yeah, it's difficult.
So I'm sure there's like mitigating controls you can do, like other layers of security you can have in place. But staying on patch management, does this then mean that you have to have sort of several different cycles of patch management? So you have to sort of be applying those sort of regular workday patches like every month or so just to keep the wheels turning. But then you also have to be looking out for like what's happening, when is there the next Log4j thing happening, and be able to respond to that like immediately.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's again tuning into threat intelligence. So having a good understanding of whether the vulnerability has got public exploit code, what are the chances of it being actively exploited as soon as it's released, and then going from there, really doing the monthly patch cycles as normal, but then any sort of ad hoc patching outside of that based on threat intelligence.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that companies especially are worried about in patching are the unexpected side effects. So there might be like issues and glitches, and they of course have impact on the business processes. So if you patch your databases that are running your sales processes, for example, and there's an issue with that, it's immediately countable with euros and dollars and yens on if there's downtime for like faulty patching. But it goes to threat modeling, and it goes to like risk management maturity in a way that understanding what is like nice to have or patching for compliance. Let's say, for example, PCR requires you to patch all the security updates within 30 days. But security patches come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. So some of them are just more important than the others. Some might be exploitable over the network without authentication, and others require physical access to your data center. So you might pretty quickly define the level of haste that you are in a way that some of them are so important and they can be exploited. Like Heidi said, they can be exploited in 24 hours. And you can expect them to be exploited in 24 hours. And if you want to keep yourself safe, you should just do the risk evaluation and understand that if it's more important to patch than not to patch. So it then accept the thing that if something might go wrong, you might have to explain this to someone and fix something afterwards. Since majority of the cases, the patches don't break anything and they just work as expected. So with this like kind of balancing out the possible negative impact and then the worst possible impact of not patching, that gives you like a pretty good meter that you can use to evaluate how quickly you have to patch.
Yeah, and you're talking about like a proper risk evaluation, not just looking at the CVSS score and deciding that we're going to patch anything over 9 immediately.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of factors to put into it, like systems, regardless of whether they're like on-prem old school systems or cloud systems, you always have other security controls and the architecture and the networking behind it and the things that you can do to mitigate and sort of narrow down what the attackers can do. They all factor in how critical this specific vulnerability is to us. How can it be exploited? What kind of impact it might have? If the impact happens, what happens next? Then they are in our front-end servers. Can they go past that? Can we detect that? Can we then stop if that might happen? So it's not immediate game over once someone exploits individual vulnerability. It's the first move on the chess game. And then you have to figure out that is this something that we can allow to happen? Can we then notice it? Can we stop the attack if it happens? So there's a lot of things to evaluate.
It comes down to the understanding what you've got, really, again, doesn't it? So, for example, if you use quite a lot of remote access solutions and they're kind of your gateway into the organization, they're effectively the keys to the kingdom if they get exploited, and potentially an attacker could find their way into the internal network. So yeah, I guess those are the types of assets that you'd look to try and patch first, because they're going to provide the most impact, if you like. And then, as Antti said, like preventing sort of further exploitation once an attacker could get in. So in a case where perhaps you can't patch at the soonest possible opportunity, reducing the risk if an attacker could get in. So can we minimize opportunities for them to move laterally within the organization? Have we got like network segregation in place, or can they literally access any system within the internal network?
So those are the things that will help you even if patches are unavailable for your thing, or they cannot be applied for whatever reason. There's something you can still do.
Definitely, and quite often you can do like mitigative actions by disabling some features or like making your own work a bit harder by, for example, if there's a vulnerability in some management console functionality of a device or something, you can just put some like jump server in front of it and make your own work a bit harder. But therefore like mitigating the possibility of someone being able to exploit it remotely, or these kind of things. Admins are surprisingly innovative when it comes to this, if you allow them to be. Because one thing that is like good also to mention is that the hackers are in general like they don't play by the rules, and they're a bit like they can do all sorts of things that come up to their mind. So they most often they chain these vulnerabilities. So it's one thing, it is not to get blinded by like the first vulnerability that you're worried about, and that if you patch this, then you're safe. Because quite often, even like the smaller importance, let's say remote code executions or something, even though that they're sort of limited in impact, they might be chained to other stuff that you have vulnerable on the same box or the same system or solution. And that sort of like amplifies their impact. So it's sometimes a bit too like, especially when the resources are rare and the companies need to prioritize hardly, they don't always think of this kind of chains that the attack includes. So that something that might seem a bit trivial can eventually like lead to same kind of impact than the pure 10-point vulnerability that you just patched. So that's why it's super important to get that kind of like intel and know your own stuff, know your own environment.
Okay. Almost everything in our life changed when the pandemic hit and people started working remotely. Did that have a lot of impact on patching, the necessity of patching, what we're talking about here today?
Yeah, definitely. I guess organizations' threat model changed completely. Organizations are now relying on the fact that people are working from home and relying on their own home networks to be secure, but also going back to remote access solutions as well. And we've seen in the last couple of years that these are a prime target now for attackers. So making sure these are patched is definitely a priority.
So was there a case of organizations just realizing that everything has to be accessible remotely and just coming up with jury-rigged solutions on how to do that, and maybe they weren't as thought out as we'd like them to be?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a bit of a panic solution in a lot of cases, wasn't it? So obviously devices had to be shipped out to individuals at home, and perhaps these didn't have the appropriate hardening implementations in place. So yeah, again, it opens up an avenue for an attacker to be able to get in through different means, really. So targeting employees working from home rather than targeting organizations' internal networks directly.
Yeah, that's definitely agree on that. And one thing that is sort of also noticeable in some organizations that we, for example, work with, is that maturity or let's say modernity of patching solutions vary quite a lot among different companies and organizations. So some companies have laptops that, for example, are installing patches directly from the manufacturer. They use some cloud-based solution that is sort of usable everywhere. But then we have these more on-site technology organizations that might have like more, I don't know how to put it nicely, but a bit old-fashioned and more clumsy processes for patching solutions, where, for example, the patches might be distributed from a server in intranet. And it might be so that to save some bandwidth, they don't install patches over VPN connections at all. So when people didn't just every now and then do work remotely and like majority of the time be at the offices where their computers actually install the patches, they were working from home all the time. So they didn't visit the offices anymore at all. And it took some time before some of these organizations even realized that since people haven't been at the office in 2 months, we don't actually see the patch levels anymore because our management solutions don't work over VPN, or the patches don't get installed over VPN because they're waiting for clients to be, or the laptops to be at the local network.
Yeah, and I guess like, you threw up those solutions like this is what will get us to tomorrow, and then it was just another day at the office and nobody ever got back and revisited those plans and redrew them and redesigned them. So we're just have been running like that ever since.
Yeah, the companies have been, of course, adapting lately. So they've been increasing increasing networks and like reconfiguring stuff and moving to cloud-based remote management solutions and all sorts of things. But these are like scenarios that weren't planned at that point. And it sort of highlights this unfortunate cultural behavior that is still seen on some companies where patching is something that doesn't get the level of recognition that it should be. It's something on the side that, all the fancy InfoSec things are done using the bleeding edge technologies and doing all sorts of like more advanced things, and patching is something from the 90s. But it's not the whole truth. I mean, without the patching as the basement, it's really hard to build like a proper foundation for any more advanced defenses.
No, that's it. We get a lot of requests for talks where people want to hear about the latest threats in the cyber landscape, and then you have to get up on that stage and let them know that you don't have to worry about the latest. Like you will be breached by completely preventable, known vulnerabilities, known attacks. Like this is what's going to get you.
Exactly. Yeah. As far as I know, our IR teams that have been investigating real like breaches, like hundreds of them, they have never seen a 0-day being used. Because there's no need for that. There's always something unpatched. There's always something that is configured like badly or something that can be exploited. 0 days cost money, and you don't use them if you don't have to.
So Katie, I know you work with our attack surface management service and you deal with clients and you hear their experiences. I guess part of the problem here is that like we're talking about basic cyber hygiene here. Like this stuff is not sexy. How do you draw attention and get those resources to address this issue?
Yeah, I guess it's about highlighting the risk. So a lot of the time when we bring a problem to a client, they actually don't know that they had that particular thing across their estate in the first place. So the first part of the problem is, obviously, we've got this new asset for you. You didn't already know about it, but perhaps we can now make sure we're monitoring this going forward. And then the second part is we've actually found this vulnerability in this particular asset. This looks like it's potentially going to be a good way in for an attacker. So this is something that you might want to prioritize in terms of your patching.
So what does this problem look like to you guys?
So I guess a good example is actually one that came from our incident response team. So this was the No Pineapple incident that's recently been published. And that's actually a classic example of where organization didn't pay attention to app level patching. And the attacker actually got in through an unpatched Zimba instance. Zimba is actually being commonly targeted in terms of just a standard technology. But we know that attackers are targeting it because they can gain access to internal networks effectively. So this is how the attacker got in. And it's just a classic example of where, organizations just focus on infrastructure level patching, but actually the most important things are the outer layer, which tend to be the application level patches as well.
Any war stories you want to share, Antti?
Yeah, the patching is a classic. So we do a lot of like current state analysis and this kind of like overall assessments where we are evaluating companies' posture on security. And I have to say that majority of our reports give some level of findings about patching. So whether it's like the coverage of the patching, so that they don't see all the technological layers like we talked before, or then they're like just fault dropped balls with the patching, so they haven't patched stuff that should have been patched. But then we have these like more complex cases to solve. I remember one of our PCI clients was they had outsourced the overall like development and the hosting of their online web shop. And we started going through the patching and we got into the operating system level of the system. So the vendor or the service provider was actually patching the operating system patches correctly. But then we started asking about the libraries that they were using when they were building that application. So the dependencies and that kind of things. And eventually they just like got lost there. They hadn't thought that PCI requirements would also require them to patch inside the application that they were doing. and they just weren't prepared for that, and they couldn't actually like confirm that they would be able to install patches within the software that they were doing within 30 days. And it became evident that they hadn't in the past. So we just had to say that this is not like compliant with PCI. And eventually our PCI client was forced to shut down the credit card payment option on that web shop. And they took like a financial hit on that. So it like the patching goes all the way and might sometimes be a bit complex to the different layers that there are in these modern environments, modern systems. And if you add in like outsourcing and someone else taking care of it, it gets complicated pretty quickly.
So I guess in your careers, you both have seen many examples of the problem that comes from not patching systems, and I'm sure the preventability of it all is frustrating to you as well. So if you had that magical one wish, what would you wish that was different in the world?
All the IoT providers would provide security patches
for their devices. Wow, okay. That's pretty magical.
I had the one you said.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's on me. Katie, do you have anything?
Patching could be applied within 1 minute and have no impact ever.
All right.
I would love that too.
What about on the more sort of practical side? Is there like any advice you'd like to give to the CISOs and security managers struggling with this problem?
Yeah, I guess going back to, what I preach every day, just having a good understanding of your assets, so both internally and externally. Remember, externally is going to be your first point in terms of where an attacker is going to target. So look at what's most critical to you in terms of your external attack surface, and then just prioritize based on, what technologies are in use, what's actively being exploited, and whether there's any proof of concept exploits.
Yeah. And for CISOs and CIOs, just a reminder that the patching is one of the most important security controls that you have for your environment and for your systems. So, and it gets really hard and complicated to your operational teams pretty quickly. So provide them with proper tooling. So value the importance of vulnerability management by providing your team with good functional tools for them to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, this is impactful stuff that will limit your attack surface.
Yes, definitely.
All right. With that, I want to thank you guys for being with us today and then talking us through this issue.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and ideas. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe.